hopefully y'all can hear me. All right, so, well, I would like to welcome you all to our event today, and it is a SAM event, and I'd like to say a little bit about SAMs. We're the senior adult ministry here, and we do lots of things. We go on trips, and we have speakers, and we go to concerts and to plays, and we like to eat out, and we do lots of things, and we like to include everybody. And we are in need of a few people who would maybe join our committee so that you can help with us some little tasks that we need. So just a little thing to let y'all know that if you can talk to Kathy or you can talk to me and join. And I hate to take away that time from what you're going to be saying, so.
Well, let's dispense with the bio stuff.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I wasn't going to say it like that. I was going to say just a little teeny bit. I was going to say there's no way we can do justice for your biography. It's quite amazing. But let me just give a teeny little bit.
That's not necessary.
All right, it's not necessary. All right, so Tom.
You know, it's not necessary.
I will just drink my tea and enjoy the song.
You've done well. You've done well.
Fall on the wheels here.
Wow.
I need to take make a couple of points to start with. And the first thing is that I want to express appreciation for the invitation to be with you today. Is the microphone at the right level, or do I need to talk louder? It's okay. All right. If you can't hear, raise your hand and we'll crank it up. I want to set the time frame that we're talking about. And to do that, we have to say that I was born in 1928, 3 years after the church celebrated its centennial, but I had nothing to do with that. My dad was the organist and choirmaster here from 1922 to 28, which is why he was asked to write the music to God of the Marching Centuries. And the fact that he was professor of music at Agnes Scott, and so many of the Agnes Scott faculty were in attendance here, and students too, it naturally went back to the college, so it's a much beloved hymn over there, and he would be so amazed and so grateful that it has found favor. And hear that people like it at the church, so that's how that worked. Okay, my childhood, therefore, would be in the 1930s, grammar school and all that. And then I hit high school at 1940 and college at 44 and got out of that at 48. So what I'm talking about is in that span of years. After that, I spent 7 years up north, 3 years in graduate schools, and 4 years in my first job teaching in a prep school in Massachusetts, and I loved it. I could have gone right back up there. In fact, I went on leave for the last graduate school thing and intended to go back up there, but my parents were elderly and it seemed the right thing at the end of the 7 years up there to come back here. And so I've been back home, and Decatur's been home always. I'm a local and a native, and have lived in only 2 houses here. And my first house is now occupied by Tom Ramsey, who went to school to my mother at Decatur High School, and they became fast friends, and Tom has added me onto the list after she died. And I keep up with Erie Avenue as well as Kirk Road now. And it's fun to have been on the south side and the north side. I have great appreciation for both places. Tom grew up on Vidal Boulevard, which is not far from my house on Erie Avenue, and is a native also, and came to Sunday school up here in his childhood years, and went to Decatur High, and I am a graduate of Decatur Girls High School, which is different from Decatur High School. But He went to Georgia School of Technology and got an architectural degree, and then worked for Stevens and Wilkinson here. Had an illustrious career and ended as president of the company before he retired. Tom knows my story, so I asked him.
It's always changing and it's always new. While we were eating, I heard about her riding horses behind Agnes Scott all the way to Memorial Drive, which I had not known before. So it's always exciting. It's just like Todd said, when you go to visit with Adele, you come away with a lot more than you went with.
Well, I don't know, but I hope you all will be at least amused today, if not.
Tell them, I think one of the stories that I loved the most was, I've always been curious about her parents, and her father came from Ohio and her mother came from Marietta, Georgia. But when they came to Agnes Scott, she told me about the first car that he had, which he built himself, and that intrigued me.
I've seen the picture of it and heard about it. And of course it was a crank out front job, no starter. And it sat high and there were no sides or roof, just the framework of the car, and you sat up on this high seat, one seat. And it had no reverse gear. So if you wanted to go the other way, you just picked the front end of the car and walked it around. This all happened as a spin-off of a StoryCorps recording that I did a couple of months ago, and Tom was my questioner at that point, and we decided that it would be more fun to follow that format today. So he's going to ask me some questions, and I'll try to answer them and spin off of there.
There's no problem with her trying to answer. Adele had a GPS like the migrating birds. She knows every street indicator. She knows the streetcar lines. It's unbelievable. I worked downtown for 40 years and know my way around downtown, but I don't remember the names of the streets. And Adele will tell me, oh, that's Pine Street, or that's at Pine in Cortland, and that's where that is. And so, at one point, we want to talk about the church, the history of the church, because that's all integral. And we didn't do that too much on StoryCorps. But I think the whole story starts with Agnes Scott and then proceeds with your father's work as an organist. And then you're being confirmed here by, was it Dr. Bradley?
No, it was before him. It was Dr. McKee. I was baptized in 1939 and was an attendant up here for all of my childhood and up until I left to go up north. Solid into Decatur Presbyterian Church, and I really want to start with that because I want to say that over the years, as I've thought back and realized how we walk in the shoes of those who come before us, I've been so grateful for the kind of Christian education that was provided for us as children, and for the preaching ministry, and for the fellowship that has been provided up here. I would be with you regularly if I didn't have this wheelchair thing to move around. It's just so clumsy to get out of the house and go somewhere. But it's worth coming, and I just regret that I'm doing it by computer now, and it's not the same. I really would love to be here. But anyway, about the church, there were many families who represent strong faith in my life. They modeled it, they taught it, they spoke it, and we were well brought up by the church here. Several people I want to name that were instrumental in my upbringing, at least. One is Catherine Carter's mother, Mrs. Wilburn. You probably all are experienced with her, but all the children went to her Sunday school and church nursery and benefited from it. She was so welcoming, such a wonderful mother figure. And she did it for a long time. In the former building, sanctuary building, one went into it again from Sycamore, and there were wide central steps. I was told sometime that it was a copy of Central Presbyterian downtown, and it had the wide central steps going up. Then you found yourself at an east-west hall that ran perpendicular to the steps. And it was as wide as a hall, and then you went down into a valley, again some more steps, and this was the lower floor of below the sanctuary, and that's where Ms. Wilburn had her nursery. Lots of toys and things around on the floor to make you feel welcome. And the children loved her and grew up loving her, and she did it for a long time. Another person I want to mention is after Dr. McKee left the ministry, it must have been in the early 40s, and I'm not sure of the date, but Dr. S. Hugh Bradley became the minister. He and his wife Agnes had been missionaries in China, and her health failed, and they had to come back to the States. They had one son, Blake, and they lived in a manse which was then on Wilton Drive. And Dr. Bradley was the minister for me through my young youth days and after Dr. McKee. He brought his DCE with him, and she's who I want to mention. Her name was Jane Shields. She was the daughter of Mrs. Holmes Smith, who became the dietitian and hostess at Columbia Seminary. She was Barbara Hull's mother, and Jane was Barbara's oldest sister. There was another sister in the middle named Cherry, and Cherry had a gorgeous contralto voice. She used to sing solos here in the choir. And she married Jimmy Green, who was Dr. J.B. Green's son, oldest child, as a matter of fact. And Cherry became Cherry Green, so we laughed about her name a little bit. But Cherry then became the soloist at Druid Hills Presbyterian for a long time. And Jimmy Green taught in schools here. The youngest child was Dorothy Green, who was my age in Sunday school, and I grew up with Dorothy. And she was a delightful person. Jane Shields really, I thought, hung the sun. She was just perfect as a youth pastor and youth convener of young people. She attracted young people. Her husband was a medic in the Army, and we were a World War II generation in the early 40s. He was abroad with the troops at that point, as was Ann Topple's father. And Jane, I think, was the reason that Mrs. Holmes Smith moved here on the death of her husband. They lived in New Orleans, and she came here with the children. And the oldest was Holmes, who was already on the mission field. And then Jane was next in line, and then Cherry, and then Barbara, and then Mitchell. Mitchell ended up marrying a friend of mine from my age group in this church, Reese Newton. I'm going to mention a few family names that you will relate to, but it's by no means complete. There were, and these are people that I remember having had a steady hand in managing the affairs of this church. They were on the session, and the ladies were as active as the men were. And so I'm going to mention Dr. James Ross McCain, who was the second president at Aggie Scott. Now, the first president has a tight connection with this church, and that's Dr. Frank Gaines, who was called to this church in 1888 from a church he had had in Virginia. At that time, he was about 10 years out of seminary, and ready to take hold down here. He came into this church when the Reconstruction years were at their height, and the South didn't have money, they didn't have means, and education was a shambles. The people in Decatur wanted good education. They would start up a school and it would last for a year or two and then go down. And there had been no consistent education until that time. But Dr. Gaines was of a mind to fix that, and so were the leaders of this church. Among them, the founder of Agnes Scott and other people in the leadership role here. In the summer of 1889, there are detailed minutes of the session, and the fact that this committee that was to hopefully found a solid school for girls met in the pastor's study in the old manse, which was a two-story white clapboard building over on Sycamore, kind of where the parking lot is. And these people met once a week from July to September in the hopes of opening the school in 1889. And Agnes Scott Institute, female seminary first, and then Institute began in that fall. And Dr. Gaines, though he'd only been here a year, left to be the first president of Agnes Scott. My father worked under him and thought the world of him. Mother did too, because when she graduated in 1913, she came back on a fellowship to teach English and stayed on to teach English until 1922. And she also worked under Dr. Gaines. Then Dr. McKee was second, so he had a real presence here, a lot of leadership from him here and at the college. Another family that was high in my observation were the Cersei Slacks, grandparents of Ann Topple, the Henry Newtons, the Lawrence Mansfields. Their children gravitated to Buckhead, so there are no descendants here. But Mrs. Mansfield had the house on Pine Tree that Davison and Kay Phillips bought to have when he was president of Columbia Seminary, at least. It never was a manse of the church. I think they just wanted Helen's house, so they bought it. I want to mention the Milton Scott family and Milton's brother Julius. I can still see Julius coming into church every morning with two little boys in tow, one of whom is David Scott, who lives over in the Mason Mill area now. And of course, Mickey Willock is the fourth child of Milton and Annie Pope Scott. And Betty Noble belongs to Betty Pope Noble's family. She married Phil Noble, and she's a child of the church too. I want to mention one other family, the L.W. Morris family. That's Wick Campbell's grandparents. I remember all this time meeting Mr. Morris in the hall one day, and he called me Adele. Most of the time I was just one of the young people, nameless. But he called me by name, and I'll never forget what a boost that gave me to think somebody knew my name. It was just amazing. Well,
I have a question.
okay.
This question relates to the Wilburn family that you were talking about. Wilburn that was taught the children.
Wilburn, right.
I'm curious, when I was in college studying architecture, I would have these adversarial conversations with Adele's mother, my former English teacher. I was very enamored of Frank Lloyd Wright, and she was not. And she told me specifically, like I was into the whole open plan, and then the house on Erie's got glass doors between every room. And she said, oh, you have to have doors between every room so the food odors don't go throughout the house. The question that I did not know, and she talked about her discussions with the architect, but she never named the architect. But the architect was Leila Ross Wilburn. And I'm curious if that Wilburn was related to the other Wilburns.
That I don't know. There was a person named Wilburn who was kin to Leila Ross that was on the faculty at Agnes Scott. She taught phys ed for many years over there.
Well, she was a graduate of Agnes Scott. How she became an architect, I don't know. But of course, the end of the story is that I ended up buying the house that Mrs. Diekman had designed, so she won the argument.
I'm just so glad Tom is over there because I get to keep up with the yard and the creatures that are there. He saw a deer going up Erie Avenue not long ago. That never happened in my experience. And he has a pair of owls that keep him company in the yard when he goes down to get in the hammock in the backyard. These owls sit in the top of the magnolia tree watching him. He's very friendly with them. And they come up.
They're good neighbors, actually.
They come up and watch his birds that live in the house and wonder who they are. And it's an amazing world over there. I'll just say a little bit about that house. Mother and Dad wanted to get off campus. They had lived at Agnes Scott. And in 1922, they bought this lot on Erie Avenue. I suspect it's because Claremont was only paved to Erie Avenue, so that would be the logical jumping off point for them to go up and buy a lot. The house on the corner where there has been a Lutheran church and it's now Smarty Academy, was a great big old two-story white house with a million steps going up from the yard to the front porch, which was completely across the front of the house. There lived Mr. Marcus Brown, who was a cotton merchant. And the back line of the Diekman property was diagonal. And so was the house next door where Henry Slack now lives. And the reason it was diagonal was that Mr. Brown kept cows in his backyard, and that was the border of the lane that led down to the cow pasture, which may have been covered up by the yards of dirt that they hauled in to make the Claremont Grammar School playground. If not, it was down somewhere on Church Street, I don't know, but the cows went back and forth. And that fence is still there, right?
It is expired.
It is expired. Oh, what a loss. Well,
The line is still
the line
evident,
is still there.
but the metal is gone. Maybe some behind the slacks, I don't know. There's a remnant.
That diagonal line was also the back line of the Slack property, and the Slacks lived in the second house up from the area on facing Claremont. Mother and Mrs. Slack were at Agnes Scott together, so we eventually had a path that went through a gate that Mr. Slack built, and we went back and forth to each other's houses through the backyard, through the path. This house that Tom has a cast iron furnace in it, which used to have coal delivered through a window on the ground floor level into the basement where there were boards that fixed a coal bin, and my dad went down and fixed the furnace every morning, put the coal in for the day. That house was built in 1922, and it still has the original furnace. I remember when we converted to gas, and it's still gas.
Good move.
That furnace may be the oldest thing in Decatur. I don't know, it's 101 years old this year.
That's right.
And
And
it's still in good
when we
shape,
moved
isn't
in, there were still the chains that you used to operate the dampers in the hall. Those are gone now. They've expired too. But the furnace is still alive and well.
I was going to say that Mr. Marcus Brown's family was two daughters. One was Fanny, and she went to North Avenue Presbyterian Church, but the other lady was a member here. She was Mrs. Alvin Moore. My mouth is getting dry. Mrs. Alvin Moore, who lived on Avery, 2 or 3 houses down from the, would you open this, please? 2 or 3 houses
I knew I had
down
some
from
utility.
Thank you very much. Her son Alvin was about my age, and they were members here at Decatur Presbyterian Church, so that's the connection that I was going to make with that. Let me go back. I made a few notes. Let me just check here. I was going to mention about the previous sanctuary building here.
Which was replaced in the 50s, you said.
Yeah, it was, this current building was done in the early 50s sometime. It had 2 spiral staircases in it. One was, as you go in the building from Sycamore Street, one was at the right-hand end, and it was, you really twisted going up that set of stairs. The other was at this back end on the corner, and it led up behind the chancel to a room that was used, it was the full width of the back of the chancel, of the width of the church. And that was where the session met, it was where the choir rehearsed, it was where any larger gathering met. And you came in one door from one side and one to the other, but in the center of the sanctuary was this round area where the choir sat in front of the organ. It was a dog of an organ. There was a curtain around the choir with a railing, and the rostrum for the presiding clergy was in front of that. And the reason that we kept that organ so long, I'm sure, was that we had as members here the southeastern representative of the Austin Organ Company. And he lived on Wilton Drive. His name was Roy Staples. And he could fix anything and did come up any hour of the day or night, and I think did it for free probably. And so that organ just went on and on. It was eternal. In the 70s, we managed to get this instrument, which I love to hear, and I love to hear Matt play. Well, wonderful stores on Sycamore Street. I'll name them for you. One was Wiles 10-cent store. We had 2 10-cent stores. Woolworth was on East Ponce, and Wiles was on Sycamore. Next to Wiles was the Weeks Grocery. Do you want me closer to the mic?
Oh, no, you're fine.
Mr. Weeks had a good representation of all that you would need, not like the chain stores now. My mother talked to Mr. Weeks every morning and ordered what we needed for that day.
Instacart.
It was delivered in 2 hours' time. And next to that was the best place of all, Mr. Bailey's shoe store. I'm talking about the father of Fred Bailey, who is a member of our church. And Mr. Bailey could fix anything leather. He had a sewing machine that would stitch up pocketbooks, backpacks, whatever. And for shoes, you never went and bought shoes after you wore out the first soles. You took them to Mr. Bailey, and he would put a second leather sole on, and you'd wear that out, and you'd take them back for a third, maybe a fourth. So that meant shoes went for a long distance in that age. And everybody loved Mr. Bailey. Across the street from there was Shields Market, which was a good grocery store, and they prided themselves on the meats, but it had a sawdust floor. So you came out with dusty shoes when you went in there. Shields had a reappearance over in Emory Village. It's a meat market there on the side of what, CVS?
Yep.
And that's a spinoff of what used to be on Sycamore Street. I want you to meet the guy that designed the first MARTA Plaza. Tom's business did that one. And you want to say anything about it?
Well, the city, it was interesting because originally, MARTA was gonna be up in front of Agnes Scott. And then the city fathers at the time, and mothers, because I think Ann Crichton was the mayor, wanted to make sure that there was a MARTA station downtown. So they changed the whole format and swung the MARTA, so now you have that bridge that goes over across, you'll know the name of the street.
Trinity.
Trinity, thanks. She's got that GPS. And so then we were hired, our firm was hired, we did 3 MARTA stations, actually. We did Decatur, East Point, and the airport. And we also did the airport, so that all tied in. But the idea was to get more life in downtown Decatur, and I suppose it's worked. For better or for worse, I can't say. But now it is a destination point where people can live and then work downtown in places without having to use a car. That's about all I can. Well, I do remember one of the interesting stories at the time that we did the MARTA station. We had to move the Confederate monument that was there in front of the courthouse about 15 or 20 feet, and it was a great hurrah that we were, not honoring the South and the sacrifice of the South. And we had all these hearings. We moved the monument. And you fast forward 50 years, and then it was like, that monument has to go. So if you live long enough, everything, I predict in 50 years there'll be another monument there, and maybe before that. But
Might well be. I remember when MARTA came through, how worried we were about the vibration that would hit the balcony organ, and whether that would shake things loose up there. But it has come through all right.
yeah.
And we worried about the walnut tree, that was the big tree out front and a little bit toward the town. But has conquered MARTA.
The trees are amazing. Right around the square there were elm trees, and everywhere in America elm trees were dying. And the hole that was excavated there was like 50 feet deep, and the shoring was like, I want to say 15 feet from the trunk of this big elm. That elm is still there. Other trees that you try to preserve die, but the elms survived, as did the walnut. As did the magnolia that's up in front of the rec center that's been there since I remember as a kid.
Yeah,
Probably.
huge tree. Yeah. I want to
Tell your dad tell them about your father and the magnolias and Agnes Scott.
Well, he and the person he shared the house with, and they lived in a little house down, it was really in Ed Winter Davis's backyard. There was a white dormitory that extended north of Inman until the 50s. And then there was this little place called East Lawn, which was a little cottage. But my dad liked to walk out Candler Street on Sunday afternoons, and he would often pick up a magnolia with his penknife and bring it back to the campus. And so he planted a lot of the magnolia trees, and the birds have done the rest. But he had a row in front of Main Building and Rebecca Scott Building, and also there was quite a grove down there around East Lawn. I want to talk to you about does everybody know about the streetcar line that came out from Atlanta that only cost 5 cents? How many of you have ridden on it? A lot of you have. So you know that the city had negotiated with the Georgia Power Company, I think it was, the 5-cent fare, and they put the worst streetcars they had on that line. They were absolutely ramshackle, and they rattled and they banged. And the streetcar came into Decatur on Howard Street and went to the old ice house. Now, I grew up with an ice box on the back porch before refrigeration. But this was refrigeration because there were two cabinets. It stood about 5 feet high. And there were two cabinets. The right-hand side, you put the things you wanted to cool. The left-hand side, you put the block of ice, which was delivered at a certain interval. I don't know how many times a week. But the old ice house is at the corner of North Columbia Drive, and the streetcar came out, and it had a detour around the depot, and it went up to the front of the ice house. Columbia Drive also crossed the railroad there, very rough, dirt always, but you could drive across from South Columbia Drive, across the railroad, and go down North Columbia to Glenwood School. That was the ice house in that corner. It's now condos. But the refrigeration extended to Presser Hall at Agnes Scott. Presser Hall was built in the 1940s. And the way they were first committed to cooling the place off when the Gaines Chapel over there, named for Dr. Frank Gaines, the way they would cool that was that there was a gap about this high, maybe 2.5 feet off the floor, under the stage. And from the basement, they would buy, from some room down there, they had blocks of ice brought in for commencement. And they would put a huge fan down there, or the fan may have been there. But anyway, the fan would blow the cooled air up out under the stage and across people. That was their air conditioning in 1940. And
How green, how green.
not up to date at all. But the rest of the streetcar, it went down to Glenwood School and then up East Ponce, and it turned and went East Court Square, and then the little jog up to McDonough Street, and at the top of North McDonough, it would stop for rest period, and there were stores along there, among them Threadgill's Drugstore, and there was an eatery on the corner of Atlanta Avenue, and you could go up there and catch the car, or a streetcar would stop all the way. It went into Atlanta on Edgewood Avenue, and it came back on Auburn, and it came back till it went dead end into a fire station, and at that point it swung back up and came out to Calb Avenue. That was the 5-cent streetcar. One time I was having a birthday dinner at the S&W cafeteria in Atlanta on Peachtree Street, and the deal was that my dad was going to go on to a rehearsal, choir rehearsal that night at the Lutheran church. He played in Atlanta churches mostly. And Mother and I would come home on that streetcar. We had to walk down to Pryor Street to catch it. Well, we got on it, and as I knew, it, rattled and shook, and I wondered if we'd get there, and we didn't. Coming out at the Whitefoot Avenue underpass, a drunk driver going high mileage hit the side of the streetcar and knocked it cat-a-cornered across the street and probably 50 feet up. The lights went out, my mother was in the aisle, I was standing up, holding on. It was a disaster scene, really. The man from the car was thrown under the streetcar, so that was bad. We went down Whitefoot Avenue and tried several houses, but measles was in every house. So Mother finally went in herself and called Cersei Slack to come pick us up. And I sat in the swing out on the front porch. So much for that streetcar.
You got what you paid for, right? You want to talk about Robert Frost?
Yeah, let's talk about Aggie Scott. How's the time? You know, and then we might have a question or two afterward.
Sure.
I was really so blessed with what happened by way of my parents' connection with Aggie Scott. Mr. Frost paid his first visit there out of friendship with a faculty member on the English faculty. He came there in 1935 first, and then skipped till 1940. Then he skipped to 1945. But after 1945, he came every year. And he came not just for a single lecture, but to stay on campus for several days, maybe a week, and be a consultant for students that wanted to write poetry and for faculty, and just to be around and have people talk to him. It was wonderful because Mother heard of the fact that they couldn't get a dinner for Mr. Frost at 11 o'clock. He didn't want to eat before he spoke. And he stayed in the alumni house where there was no food service when he first came. And so she offered to have him for dinner after the lecture, which was 11 o'clock or so. And he got to where he wanted to do the same thing this year that he'd done last year. So it was a repeat performance. And she would have 14 people was max. There would be some college faculty, a student or two, friends of mine. She made it a point to have a few townspeople and to have a mix of people for him. Well, the dinners were preceded by her getting some help in the kitchen because she had taught school all day at Decatur High, and then she had to get this meal ready, and she went to the lecture for sure, and it had to be there ready to go. So the person that she called on was the maid in Dr. McCain's house, who was the sister of the maid we had. And there was another one that lived, you won't believe it, but way over behind the railroad tracks at the corner of North Decatur and Claremont. She lived in the woods back there on the Atlanta side.
That's where
of the
Will
tracks.
Porter lived.
And we went and picked her up.
Yeah.
And anyway, the dinner table was always interesting because Mr. Frost hadn't unwound from his lecture. So it was kind of a monologue for a while, though he really talked to people as well, and they would ask him questions. And I remember one year he'd get on a theme and he'd spin it over and over. He was fascinated with the young senator from Massachusetts, John Kennedy. And was he going to be president? And he just had 1,000 ideas about that and talked about it a lot. And then Kennedy, you remember, at the end of Frost's life, sent him to Russia as the American ambassador. I think it was Khrushchev he dealt with. Can't quite remember. But Mr. Frost's health almost didn't get him there, and it did fail. He died in the start of 1963. So his last visit was really 62. He never came in 63. But those were interesting affairs, and I think back to them now. To hear him read his poetry with his New England brogue and with the pacing that he did as he read the poetry was really a wonderful experience. I couldn't begin to imitate what he did, and I don't think anybody else could. And do you remember that he wrote a poem for the inauguration of John Kennedy? And it was a very cold day, and the sun was very bright, and Mr. Frost couldn't see to read the poem that he had written for the occasion, so he switched to a poem he had previously done, which was about the founding of America. It was the poem called The Gift Outright, and he recited that one instead of the one he had written. But it's just really been a wonderful experience to have a firsthand communication repeatedly with that figure from New England. And then I ended up teaching in New England, and he used to tease me about teaching when he came. And I taught Latin and did music also at the school I was at in Massachusetts. And one of the volumes of poetry that we submitted for him to autograph was ascribed to my friend in the classics, Adele McKee. So, and one year, Mother was getting a book signed, and she tried not to do that at the dinners. She tried to take them over to the library and have them done when he did a group on campus. But he signed his name, Robert Lee Frost, and looked up quizzically at her. She was watching him write it. And he looked up quizzically and said, and she said, "This is Robert E. Lee's birthday." And that was why he had done it. His name was Robert Lee Frost, named for Lee. So that was something I remember.
And then as an epilogue, the last dinner, Ann Topple and I were supposed to be the butlers and servers. And we were deprived of that by his untimely death, even though he was quite old. You remember that?
And that was 1963.
We had been chosen. I'm sure Ann remembers it. It's like the great regret. And then I had a friend that, in fact, I think the Thigpens were in this church too. Does that ring a bell? But I had a friend, Carol Thigpen, who married another Nobel Prize winning poet, Czesław Miłosz. He came to visit the area, so I said, "Well, you're the second famous poet that's been here." He said, "Who was your first?" And I said, "Robert Frost."
Carl Sandburg came. They had, and Mary Ellen Chase, who taught biblical literature at Smith. I remember her lecture. But they tried to bring outstanding people to the lecture series over there, poets. And I think I was turned on by the inaugural organ concert when Virgil Fox came in 1940 in November and played the opening concert. And they had the console up on the rostrum, not the stage level, but the rostrum, with the console turned so the audience could watch his maneuvers. And it was just fascinating. And I think it was that day that made me decide to study organ. And I really buckled down then and tried to play. Yeah.
And did well.
A little late, but better late.
Better late than never.
It's been a great ride, a great journey, and I've enjoyed every segment of it. And I hope that you get some sense of the good time that I've had with being here in Decatur. Tom, what?
I was just going to say, that one of the things I'd asked her about life in Decatur in the 30s was, where did you go swimming? What amusements were there? And she told me there was Tom's swimming hole.
Uncle Tom.
Uncle Tom's swimming hole. Even better.
This was the same site as present Glen Lake, but it was called Uncle Tom's. It had a high board fence toward Church Street so that end was not visible from you couldn't see in the swim pool. But you went in about the same place you do now. And there were bleachers on that side, inside that board fence, where people could sit. And then there were on the far side as well.
And was it just a pond?
No, it was a real swimming pool.
Oh, it was a swimming
but
pool.
It was not quite as big as what's there now.
I see.
But that lasted for a long time. That was the place to go.
And then the other thing I remembered, my mother telling me before I was born about an airplane crashing over where Venetian swimming pool is now. And Adele and I studied that. She remembered it, but finally.
I remember when it happened.
Yeah, but we finally found it, and it was a bomber, a B-52 or something that went down over there.
Mm-hmm. When you go down
1942.
Coventry Road toward Clifton and get to the bottom, first hill bottom down by the creek, it was to the left over in the woods that the bomber went down. and it burned a wide swath of trees, which have now replaced themselves. But that was quite an event when it was sometime during the Second World War.
It was 1942.
Yeah.
Yeah, we finally traced it. It took a long time. The problem whenever I talk with Adele is something else comes up and I have to do more research. One of the things was there was a tornado that destroyed Gainesville, Georgia that I knew nothing about, and Adele knew about it.
Yeah, it was 1936. I remember being sent home early from Glenwood School, and I remember the feel of the atmosphere. The sky was green, it was very sultry, and we didn't know, we had been warned that storms were around, but we didn't know what was coming, but they sent school children home, and it simply devastated the downtown part of Gainesville, and destroyed the downtown up there. There's something else. This could, go on. Do you have questions or comments that you want? Yeah.
When my family first moved to Decatur, we rented a house almost directly across from the Bradley Observatory. And do you know the history of that? How long the observatory had been on the campus at Agnes Scott?
It was not there when I was in school, so
Oh,
it has
wasn't.
happened since I came. In fact, Mother and Dad knew the astronomer that had come from someplace in Pennsylvania, and he wrote a book on Halley's Comet. And it was definitive for a long time, and I passed on our copy of it to the department at Agnes Scott, so it's in their library over there. The house next to the observatory was where the Henry Newton family lived, who were major players up here. Donna lived in that house, I think, for a while.
Hancock, you mean?
No, down by the observatory.
Oh, you
Yeah.
mean when I was saying stuff, yeah.
George,
Do you know if the church lost any lives during World War I or World War II?
I missed that.
Did the church lose any lives in World War I and World War II in terms of parishioners?
I don't remember about the church, but I remember one of our classmates, Ed Ravenel, was lost, and Decatur did lose some other citizens, young men. They were just a year or two ahead of me.
Adele had told me, there's a question in the back.
That's Cheryl?
Yeah.
Yes, that's Cheryl. I'm sitting here, as many have said, rejoicing in the great blessing of knowing you, and I've known you for decades, although I'm not from Decatur. Actually, I was, as a baby in Decatur, grew up in Miami. I am reminded that these roots are deep and that our inheritance is rich. My question for you is, what is your wish for Decatur and this area and this church as we look ahead?
That question would require some thought. I would hope that the vision of many of the leaders of this church would go forward. This has been a strong church for its history. And my prayer would be that it would continue to minister to this community as well as it's doing now and has done in the past, and that we would have the vision to change as needed to meet the needs of the people around us, and that we would continue to show forth Christ's love in community and do whatever it takes to fulfill that ministry. I would wish great success to this church in continued leadership, in solving the problems of humanity that we confront, but I would like to think about that even more.
I
That's a
would
good
love-
question.
I would love to call you in a couple of weeks and talk about it.
Okay.
I think
George,
one
what
of
were
the-
you gonna say?
The perspective of, that Adele has on the changes that are happening, I mean, we all know that change is inevitable, but she has a very interesting perspective, and when she talks about going to the store and meeting people, and then I think of during the pandemic, being masked and going in and rushing and getting everything out, I mean, how different the culture is than it was just as things move forward. So it's hard to say what Decatur would be like in the future.
Yeah. I will say, apropos of the Second World War, that we had a very great awareness in the high school of the needs of the world and of the country, and no sense that we would win that war. It was a high tension time. And they used to gather us in the assembly room at Girls High. We had a great big bin down front that we brought tin cans to fill the need for metal for the war effort. And we were urged, when you ate something out of a tin can, to cut both ends out and squash the can, and then you brought it in a grocery sack or something, and we had competitions between home rooms to who could bring the most tin cans for the war effort. And we sang the songs of the service corps. We sang the Anchors Away, the Army Air Corps song, and so on. The good pianist was just a year ahead of me in school, and she could play anything by ear. And I'm talking about Ann Moore Boyd, who founded Opus One, the music store in Decatur. And she would really whomp it up on the piano and make everybody just join. You had to join in and sing because it was such vibrant playing. The other thing was the ration board was behind the school library, which was the ground floor of the auditorium between Girls High and Boys High. Boys High building was down in the hollow, and the back of it led onto the playing field. And then there was this auditorium, the main floor of which was a basketball court, and where basketball competitions were held, and then it also was a gathering space for the town. You would have town meetings there with chairs. And then the lower floor was the library for the two schools on either side, and kids could come at study hall and go down there. But behind that, on that ground floor, was the ration board, which dispensed coupons. And it was a constant parade of people that were going down there to apply for something or other. Mother worked at the ration board, and sometimes she would come home with a story of somebody from Atlanta that had come out here to illegally get some coupons for something or other. She actually named names, but I only remember one name, which I won't tell you anyway.